Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Mara Grzanek. I am the Family Engagement Coordinator at Stevenson High School. And today we are going to talk about how do we help our teens make decisions. It's a real process. There's big decisions, little decisions. But if we give our teens some strategies around making decisions, then perhaps they have more tools to use as they are on their own making decisions for themselves. So let's start talking about some of those ways to make decisions. So one thing to think about is, how do you make decisions? What do you do? Are you a list maker? Do you talk to your most trusted friend? What do you do? Making decisions is one of the skills that are not fully formed until your teen is about 25, because what you're asking a student to do, what you're asking a human to do, is to make constructive choices about their personal behavior and their social interactions that are based on ethical standards and safety concerns and social norms. And then also think about, what are the consequences of each of those actions, right? So what we need to be able to do is make decisions for ourselves, but that are going to be socially acceptable decisions, right? So sometimes they don't impact other people, but as we become more and more engaged in society, our decisions may have bigger and bigger impact on other people. So when we talk about making ethical decisions, that may be, am I open-minded? Am I curious? How can I analyze data and make a reasonable, rational decision? So how can I explain my decision to someone else? Am I culturally responsive in my decision making? Can I anticipate or evaluate what kind of consequences may come from when I make this decision? And can I talk about how my decision is impacting others? And now, things like, what kind of ice cream flavor do you want, or what do you want for dinner? That may not be the kind of decision we're talking about. However, we can take a small thing like that and talk about how do you make a decision, because decisions are based on emotions, right? And so the reason we know that young people, teens, are not really great at making decisions, and they need some support in making decisions, is that part of their brain that helps them make those reasoned decisions is not fully formed until they're 25. So now, can they decide, like, what do I want for dinner? Yeah, but like those big decisions, sometimes they need an objective way of looking at a decision process, like that decision-making process, because they're so pulled by sort of their peers and what other people are doing, and how, they can't really think about maybe sometimes, how is this going to impact things? So when your teen may make a decision that's, not a good decision, and you say, what were you thinking? And they say, I wasn't thinking. They really aren't thinking. They really are just fly by the seat of their pants. It's developmentally what they're doing, right? So what we can do is slow down that process for them, not in every decision that they make, but when you're having a conversation about what should you do, maybe it's, should you join a new club? Maybe it's what do you want to have for dinner? But having the conversation and leading our teens through a decision-making process helps them build the capacity to make choices for themselves and think about how that may impact others. It's a skill. Everything we talk about during these 15-minute shorts are these skills that we want to help our teens develop, so that when they're out on their own, they at least have had practice doing it, and they can think a little bit about, what do I want to do? So when they have to make a decision, they learn to pause, evaluate what's happening, look at the consequences of their options, that they have and make some kind of constructive decision before they just react, right? So when we're thinking about helping our teens make decisions, what we want to do as the adults in their lives, knowing that the decision-making process is not going to be fully formed until they're 25, is lead them through some processes of making decisions so they have practice doing it, so that it becomes a habit of mind, not they just internalize making the decision, but the process of stopping, evaluating, thinking about what they're going to do, and then making the decision. That process becomes more of a habit for them rather than the spur of the moment, what they developmentally are prone to do, right? It doesn't mean that if you go through this process with your teen once, twice, 5 times, that when they're out with their friends and their friends all say, hey, let's go do this stupid thing, that they're not going to do it. They are, because they're so drawn to their teens. But when you're doing things like talking about what classes are you going to take next year, having this discussion and making a decision about what classes they should take, that can be part of a decision-making process, right? Maybe they're choosing between 2 classes. So let's talk about a few decision-making processes that you can help your teen with. And then we're going to talk about a few different strategies, and then we'll talk about, how to look at those. So the first one is, we're going to talk about 3 different ones. One is a T-chart, one is SOTAs, that's an acronym, and one's a decision tree. Okay, so the first is a T-chart, pros and cons, really, really flat out. What do you sit down? I want to do this. This is the decision I'm making. This is if I do this, if I make this decision, what are the pros of doing this? What are the cons of doing this, right? We see a lot of, that's kind of a good decision for making a T-chart, is a good decision for like a yes, no, not a choice between things, because then you're going to have all sorts of decision trees or T-charts. But should I go with my friends and do this, or should I not? Or should I join this team, or should I not? Pros, cons. What are the pros? What are the cons? Now, what's important with you as the adult in the teen's life is to sit down. And really, it's hard because we want our teens to make the decisions that we hope they make, but to be as objective as possible and ask them open-ended questions about, so why do you feel that's a pro? Okay, great. So what are the pros? What are the cons? You can always say, like, what impact do you think this might have on you in 6 months, depending on what it is, or in a year or whatever. So the first one, decision tree or T-chart, pros, cons, pretty straightforward, lay it out. You can do it anywhere. The second one is something called SOTAs. That's an acronym. That stands for situation. What's the situation that you're in? What are the options? This chart shows option 1, option 2, option 3. What are things that you can do for each of those options? What would be the disadvantages of each of those options? It's a T-chart. What are the advantages of each of those options? And then what are you going to do? So what you do is separately, you say, what's the situation at hand? What's happening? What are 3 different options I can have in terms of like a behavior or the choices I can make, right? What would be a disadvantage of each of those options, an advantage of each of those options, right? So disadvantage, 3 disadvantages, 3 advantages of each of those options. And then what's the solution? Because what you would do then, as objectively as possible, it's really hard when you have a team to be objective, right? But that's kind of what you want to do, is to be as objective as possible with them. Open-ended questions. Let them think out their decision-making process. Let them verbally talk about their decision-making process. Because what you're doing in the decision-making process and helping them make decisions is you're helping them form the habits of mind and practice the decision making. Making responsible decisions is one of the social emotional learning constructs that there are the 5 ones that we talk about at school. And making responsible decisions is one of them. So what you want to do as the adult in your teen's life is to help them practice making those decisions. So the first one was the T-chart, very straightforward, positive, negatives. The second is a little bit of a riff on that. And if there's more than one option, you can put it on one piece of paper. What's the situation? What could be decision number 1, decision number 2, decision number 3? Try to stick to 3. It's hard when you have like 10 different options. What are 3 advantages? What are 3 disadvantages of each? Have a conversation about those, and then you can come up with a solution. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one is a decision tree. A decision tree is like those if-then statements, right? When you do a decision tree, it's like a flow chart, right? It's like this graphic. But what it allows your team to do, so in a T-chart, it's positive, negative, and all of the talking, all of the decisions like, well, if that happens, then this might happen. If that, none of that is overt, and your team can't necessarily see it. A decision tree allows your team to see, if I do this, I won't be able to do that. Or if I do this, then I'll be able to do that. And it's a visual representation of what the possible outcomes of their decisions are. So what a decision tree helps do is make really abstract things concrete. So, right, so what you would do is say, if I do this, so it's like that positive, negative. If I do this, this may happen, and then that could happen, or this may happen, and then that could happen. And it allows for sort of what you discuss to be on paper written down. And it kind of like, do I do it? Yes. Then what can happen? No. Then, no is like, well, then it doesn't happen, right? Up in the graphic is, do I want a donut? So you say, do I want a donut? Yes or no? Yes, I want one. Or do I deserve it? Am I sure? Go ahead and eat the donut. Nope, I shouldn't eat the donut. Go do some jumping jacks or whatever. But in a decision tree, it takes what's abstract and makes it very concrete. So today we talked about T-chart, positives and negatives, right? Pluses and minuses of a decision. We talked about the SOTAs, which is basically make a T-chart for 3 different options. You have a situation, option, what's your behavior for option 1? 3 positives, 3 negatives. What's your option for 2? 3 positives, 3 negatives. An option for 3, 3 positives, 3 negatives. And you as the adult in their life have a conversation around it, and then you come up with a solution. A decision tree is really good if your teen is not good at making abstract decisions and thinking about, well, what did we say? What would happen with that? If you find yourself going around in circles a lot, making a decision tree is probably good, or you're going to come back to that discussion. Making a decision tree is probably pretty good, because then it brings all that conversation back, back into view. Now, what do you do at the end of making a decision? What's really important is that you connect what choices are and future goals, right? So they have to be able, what's really important for our teens to see is how the actions that they take right now may impact their future goals. Like, are we taking our favorite classes and activities? And how do those favorite classes and activities work into future goals, right? So if your student really loves robotics and is taking all these robotics classes, how could that impact what they want to do in the future? We are at the time when our students are choosing classes. So this is a really great time to have these conversations about, okay, if you do that, how's it going to impact moving forward? And you can use the course book. It's all digital, it's online as well. You can use that course book to say, okay, let's look at, if you take this class, could you go to the next one, whatever. we need to help our teens and allow our teens make their own decisions, because what it allows them to do is it allows them to move forward and navigate any kind of challenges on their own. But then what's important for you to do is reflect back on that process with them. If they take a class that it turns out to be like, hey, this is the class I like to take, or I wanted to take, then can you have that conversation about, well, what are some of the things that you're learning in that class that you wouldn't have learned otherwise? Or how would you like to move forward from taking this class, whatever. Or you chose a situation with some friends that didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, but then what happened? And what can you learn from that? And how did your decision-making impact the situation? And how did it impact what happens in the future, right? So if it's really hard to make a decision as well, sometimes it's easiest to say to your team, what would you tell your best friend? Or if they have a sibling, if your sibling asked you if they should do this, what advice would you give them? To take themselves a little bit out of the decision-making process and let them be a little bit more reflective around how did I make this decision? How did it impact others? What impact did my decision make on me, or what impact did my decision make on others? So today we talked about how to help our students, our teens make decisions. We talked about making a T-chart, positives and negatives. We talked about the SOTAs, multiple options for like that positive, negative option. You have a situation, option 1, 3 positives, 3 negatives, option 2, 3 positives, 3 negatives, option 3, 3 positives, 3 negatives for the same situation, and then come up with a decision at the bottom. We also talked about making a decision tree, which makes making a decision much more overt and visible for a student. That's really good if you know that you're going to come back to a decision, or your child, your teen has a problem with those kind of abstract concepts. We finally talked about the importance of reflecting on your decisions and having a conversation with your teen about, hey, how did that decision work out? How did it benefit? What would you do differently in the meantime? Remember, please, that your role in this is not to point out, I told you you should have done it a different way. I knew it wasn't going to work out. Nope, that doesn't help. What you are doing is building a relationship with your teen. And so you are trying to be open-ended and reflective and ask open-ended conversations and let your teen come to those conclusions. They will come to those conclusions. But remember, decision-making process is not fully formed until they're 25. And when they're 25, they're not going to come to you and ask you those big questions. They'll ask you maybe for your advice, but they may be independent living adults and they may be making decisions on their own. So you want to foster the decision-making process and help along with the decision-making process when they're teens right now, when they're living with you and making these choices. Thank you very much for joining me today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about supporting strong study habits. We are well into the semester. In less than, 6 weeks, I think. In the next 6 weeks, they will be taking the last summative evaluations for this semester. And so we really want to make sure, are our students studying the most effective way? How can we help them use all the resources that are at Stevenson High School to help them be the best student they can be? So we'll talk about that tomorrow at noon. I thank you very much for joining me. Remember, if you joined us a little bit later today, a copy of this will be on the Stevenson High School Family Engagement YouTube page. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you have a great afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.